you talked about evolutionary processes in your answer around hope, and we talk about preserving the Great Lakes, but other than sort of, I guess it's possible that we could just drain them and ship the water someplace else. But outside of that possibility, the lakes are going to be here whether we do something or not. What has always been curious to me, and I is probably a sign of my ignorance more than anything else, is when we talk about preserving, because the lakes have always changed. You talked about evolutionary processes. What version of the lakes is it that we're trying to preserve? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's at the core of the ecological concept of resiliency. And so rather, earlier conservation efforts and management efforts were aimed at protection, picking a moment in time, and they often called it pre-human or pre-settlement, as though indigenous people weren't human and weren't here, which is deeply offensive. But, pre-European invasion, pre-18th century states of nature, we were going to restore back to that and then hold it there. And that just doesn't work because things are always changing, whether or not humans are part of those changes. So Hollins developed, an ecologist named Hollins developed the concept of resiliency back in the 50s, I should know, 50s or 60s, and argued that the true goal should not be protection of a moment in time, but because things are going to change, there's always going to be disturbance, but instead resiliency came about from a set of ecological relationships that allowed systems to change in response to perturbation. They could change all the time, but then to be able to reassume not the earlier state, but the patterns and processes that that had allowed them to persist. And I'm being kind of vague right now. So a forest fire might sweep through, and resiliency didn't mean keeping the fires out, trying to protect it untouched, but allowing the fires to burn, but trying to protect, say, creeks and other, networks, so that the species that had to flee to creeks would be able to then re-inhabit. And so a system that's not resilient, that's been pushed too far outside the boundaries of resiliency, either by very intensive logging or by very rapid climate change, after, say, a fire sweeps through, it changes to a very different set of ecological states that, for example, you'll never get a forest in there reestablishing in the next 2,000 years, because when the canopy cover is completely gone or the creeks are burned, then there's just no way you can have a forest again. So in that sense, a massive change for Lake Superior might be a set of changes that happen where the lake is no longer oligotrophic, where it's where it becomes a hypereutrophic lake, sort of like, I don't know, Lake Mendona and Madison, always covered by algal blooms, where it becomes warm. It doesn't have turnover twice a year. It doesn't have the sort of different layers, cold, warm, and then massive turnover, which all these species depend on. And those were the huge concerns in the 1960s and 70s, when the scientists and grassroots activists really realized that the eutrophication, cultural eutrophication that was going on with taconite, iron pollution, was, had the potential to change the lake very dramatically from a cold oligotrophic lake to a eutrophic kind of like Lake Erie, covered by toxic algal blooms.
Right.
I mean, that probably wouldn't have happened, but, we're seeing algal blooms on Lake Superior now. Bob Sterner.
I heard about that.
Yeah, there have been three, a big one in 2012, another one in 2016, another one in 2018, some small blooms this year. And they each year followed those first 3 years, first time ever in recorded history we could find any records of algal blooms on Lake Superior, which is typically too cold a lake. And they had followed 3 years where there was warming, but also a very intense flood event that put a lot of nutrients and sediment into the water, typically about a month earlier. So we've had 3 so-called 500-year flood events in just 6 years. So it should, floods happen, but you'd expect it in 1,500 years and instead in 6 years, which is consistent with the models of how precipitation is changing in the basin. But, those floods followed by warming temperatures, the lakes, Lake Superior is the fastest warming lake in the world. And we've seen this year really intense warming. And so if this continues, if Lake Superior begins to be like Lake Erie with massive algal blooms, it will change something profound about the lake. So even though I agree with you, there's no single state protecting, we can't protect Lake Superior like it was 100 years ago, but we can do things to protect its resiliency. And that can be as simple as making sure there's 20% forest cover in the small streams that feed into Lake Superior. So the sediment, and so when you have an intense rain event, you don't get that sediment movement, that pulse into the lake that's associated with later algal blooms. So there's all sorts of stuff we can do to protect the resiliency of the lake. And a lot of that happens with with thinking about what's happening on the land, not just in the water. And a lot of it has to do with getting everybody out to vote on November 3rd or before that. Yeah, no, because politics is also about protecting resilient options for the future.
Well, and not just for water and land, but people too, all the way around.
Absolutely. Yeah.